and good evening. Thank you for joining us here on BNC Live. I'm Brittany Jones. Tonight, we begin with the latest on the pandemic. Some states are seeing an increase in COVID cases, this while more employees line up for the shot to meet vaccine mandates. Now, Johns Hopkins University says more than 56% of the U.S. population is fully vaccinated. That's more than 185 million people. But there are still millions who remain hesitant about getting the shot. Some health experts say people believe natural immunity is more effective than the vaccine. A new antiviral pill could be a game changer in the fight against COVID-19. Merck says the drug could cut the risk of hospitalization and death in half if you have COVID. Scientists welcome the potential new treatment to help prevent serious illness from the virus, which has killed almost 5 million people around the world.
What we know is it does seem to have an impact on the clinical course of COVID-19. It seems to reduce the if you take it for a treatment course early on in the course of the illness, once you start to get sick, it could reduce the likelihood that you'll go to the hospital, but it's no guarantee. And so there's a lot of attractive features about it, just like there is for Tamiflu for influenza, which is another way to think about this. As I think somebody mentioned once, it was like Tamiflu for COVID. And we know how that works. It does reduce the severity of illness, but doesn't prevent it entirely. But it can potentially keep a lot of people out of the hospital.
Now, Merck says it plans to seek emergency authorization as soon as possible. Pfizer and Swiss drug maker Roche are also racing to develop an easy-to-administer antiviral pill for COVID-19. For now, only antibody cocktails, which have to be given through an IV, are approved for non-hospitalized patients. Dr. Lane Rowling is with us tonight to talk about the latest on the pandemic. Doc, good evening to you.
Good evening. Super fantastic, Brittany, and to the BNC staff.
And Doc, you heard what the doctor just said. Merck and Ridgeback Biotherapeutics say they now have a pill that will cut the risk of hospitalization or death from COVID-19 by half. If it's approved, it'll become the first oral medicine that will help fight the virus, assuming it's like Tylenol or something like that, I assume. What's your thoughts on taking a pill to help fight the virus?
Well, I mean, if it's a strong possibility, then we should bring it to the forefront as an effective treatment. But the reality is that, this is what they're saying again, is experimental use authorization. So what does that mean? I would like to see the data. I think everybody should see the data and be informed on what the results are. Are the results based off of a clinical trial? Is it based off of a real presentation of the population? Are you giving this medication to children? Are you giving it to patients that have immunocompromised disease? Are you giving it to old folks and trying to get a good assessment of the effectiveness of the stuff? And once again, it's a potential game changer, but the data and the medicine and science is still out on that. And the reality is that we still have a long ways to go. And one of the things that's always difficult, very difficult to come up with treatment for ours. So if this is a Merck comes up with an effective treatment, a drug, I welcome it.
Yeah. And Doc, there are some countries now saying they are basically just going back to normal and just trying to live with COVID, basically. We talk about Denmark, Singapore, Thailand, South Africa. The country's leaders are saying they have high vaccination rates and some reporting lower cases. Is this good or bad that they're letting their guard down? What do you think?
Well, the reality is it is bad letting the guard down, because what's going to happen is that you're going to create new super mutations. That is the reality. You can't have half the population vaccine, other half not vaccinated, and then this is what happens. You start interchanging that virus between the two populations. The virus gets an opportunity to live. The virus gets an opportunity to see what's in the vaccine, and this is how you create mutations. And the societies that do open up now, because of the economic reason, are going to be the societies that are going to shut down first. That is just the reality, because the virus is still not under control. We're still endemic infection. We have a long ways to go until we have an effective policy and procedure where everybody in the world, Brittany, is following that policy and procedure, from one, wearing antiviral masks, washing your hands, air purification units, understanding the public space, understanding testing, both antibodies and also testing individuals on a weekly basis. We're never going to get a hold of this virus, and we're going to continue to have mutations, and you see the numbers are going up now. We're right in the middle of September, October, November. Folks, we have a long ways to go, and the next 3 months is going to be critical for America and the world.
And talk about that, Doc, because you mentioned the next 3 months. This is the month that we have Halloween, Thanksgiving, the following month, Christmas, and next month, all of the holiday parties. As we were starting to see some drop in cases, we saw this last year that right after the holidays, the numbers spiked up. Do you think we'll see that again?
Oh, absolutely, Brittany. You've seen this in your own eyes over the year we've done this. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that, folks, if we look at what the basic numbers that they're telling us, 2,000 people are dying a day. We know that number is probably wrong. It's probably 3,000 people are dying a day. You do 30 days times 3, that gives you the number 90,000 a month. You do that over 3 months, you're already up to almost 300,000 people. We will hit the 1.1 million mark by New Year's. That's a reality unless we get this train off of the track and going into a different direction. And that is the reality, and not getting caught up in conspiracy theories, misinformation, disinformation. The science has to back the medicine, and the medicine has to understand the science for us to be able to move through this. We have to come up with vaccines that are effective. When I say vaccines that are effective, mm-hmm. I mean we have vaccine for the alpha strain, the beta strain, gamma strain, etc. And we have to make sure people understand that this is going to be a long time work in progress as the science and medicine catches up. That is the reality.
And Doc, as you mentioned, we are inching closer to 1 million. The U.S. surpassed 700,000 COVID deaths on Friday, and our country still has the most COVID deaths than any other country. But the number of positive cases are dropping, but some states are still seeing an increase in hospitalizations. How are we seeing an increase and a decrease at the same time? How does that happen?
It depending on who's providing the numbers. We know that the state of Florida is very adamant about not giving information. Texas is that way too. Mm-hmm. And these are two of the biggest populous states in the union. So you can imagine if that number gets added to the tally, maybe we do not have a decrease in the positive rate. In fact, I would argue that the positive rate is going to be much higher than last year at this time, because now we got kids going back to school. We have football games are going on, sporting events, more people congregated together. And then what happens is that 6-foot rule of social distancing does not come into play. We have the potential to have super spreader events, and that is why we look at some schools in Florida, Texas, and North Carolina have shut down because they have COVID outbreaks in the individual schools.
Yeah. There's so much still unfolding with this. Dr. Lane Rowling, virologist and infectious disease expert. Thank you for your time. We'll see you next Sunday. Well, the nation is also divided when it comes to the COVID vaccine. President Biden's recent vaccine mandate has people on both sides of the fence, some who are rolling up their sleeves and others who are walking off their jobs against it. So this has also created division among families, with some giving into pressure to keep the peace. Florida's newly appointed Surgeon General, Joseph Ladapo, says the COVID vaccine is being treated like a religion, and it is not an end-all treatment for the disease. Joining me now are the hosts of the All Revved Up podcast, where faith intersects with politics and culture, Reverend Irene Moreau and Reverend Dr. Emmett G. Price III. Welcome to you both. I'm happy to see you guys back here on BNC.
Delighted to be here.
Yeah, definitely. And Reverend Moreau, we'll start with you. People across the country, including frontline workers, are walking off their jobs because they don't want to get vaccinated. Florida's newly appointed Surgeon General, who I just mentioned, says the vaccine is being treated like a religion. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts. One of the things that we got to recognize is that as a country, we all have COVID fatigue, whether we're adhering to the CDC guidelines or not. But with that fatigue here, we have to generate new ways to convince people why that this is a marathon, that this will not go away. And he said it. You said more kids, more students are now out and about. More people are going to sports events. But I live with an ER physician. My spouse is an ER physician, and what her hospital did was mandate that if you are in healthcare, you have to take the vaccine. What I've done on a religious level is I gave a sermon today because so many showed up, which I was surprised about being the good Samaritan and what it means to live in community in a time of a pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And Reverend Price, the vaccine debate is also dividing families. She mentioned in the church, with some giving in into the peer pressure to say basically you got to vaccinate. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, this is a difficult season for the nation and for human beings in general. Something that should bring us together, this crisis of a pandemic, is actually tearing us apart because of the misinformation, the disinformation, and the divisiveness and the politicization of this moment. And so, whether one is vaccinated or unvaccinated, I think people have a decision. People have a decision to make about what they will do with their bodies. However, that decision has to be relative to our coexisting and living in this world, in this country, in this nation, in this, around this world together. And so I think the challenge is that the numbers do not lie. 1,157 dead in the United States, 4,801,011 dead around the world. Those numbers do not lie. Dr. Rowland just shared that we need to get back to what it was that we were doing before we had the vaccines, which is wearing your mask, social distancing, washing your hands, and understanding that we are in relationship with one another.
Yeah.
And Reverend Moreau, have you seen that divide also among the clergy as well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things we got to understand about this pandemic, it hits different demographic groups differently, those who are anti-vaxxers. For instance, if you're African American, you will get, and you're part of the African diaspora, you certainly will get the argument, and rightly so, about the history of, malpractice, medical experimentation, health disparities. And of course, we know the story about the Tuskegee study, and then a more recent, incident with Henrietta Lacks with her quote immortal cells here. So you have that demographic group, because that group is sometimes very different than what you say white evangelicals. So their reason is not based so much on religion, and it's not about a dislike or a cognitive dissonance between what religion says and what the healthcare profession says. It's about a deep mistrust. I'll tell you something what one of my parishioners said this morning to me, and who is not vaccinated, said this. It says, I'm suspicious of the vaccine. And I said, so why? He says, because I can get the vaccine free, walk in any drugstore in Massachusetts. But if I want a COVID test to see if I'm negative or positive, I have to pay hundreds of dollars. So those kind of little small, what we might think minutia issues have to be addressed. When you're talking about white evangelicals, they will use religion, and they will say like J&J is compromised because they're using an aborted fetus. So, I mean, we got to sort of communicate and message our, pro-vaccine campaign to different demographic groups. And then for the LGBT community, which I deal with, they don't want to get vaccinated because they'll be misgendered, seen as other, and they feel like their bodies are being experimented with by the mere fact that you don't see the totality of who they are.
Yeah. And Reverend Price, what do you say? Some people are against the COVID vaccine for religious reasons. What have you been able to speak? How have you been able to speak to them for those folks who say that they don't want to get it because of those reasons?
Well, I mean, there are various religions around the world. We should not perceive that everybody's Christian, but for those who are Christians, I think, the second part of John 10:10 is my favorite, that Jesus said, I came that you might have life and life more abundantly. For folks who are not necessarily Christians, but who have a spiritual journey, a spiritual path, I think all of the spiritual journeys and paths talk about life, talk about vitality, talk about coexistence, talk about understanding that you are part of a greater being. And so even as we make difficult decisions, and there are some who need to make a decision based on where they are in terms of their health journey, in terms of their spiritual life. I think the simple fact is this, that before we had the vaccine, we understood to keep the mask on, the social distance, and to also respect each other's proximity. Now that we do have the vaccine, it is our hope that individuals will actually do their research, find the data that is out there, and understand that there is more data that shows that these vaccines are keeping people from dying, even if they do get the illness. So I think the facts are there. People have to have access to the information without it being divisive.
Well,
can I say something though?
We're out of time, Rev, but I would love to have you both back. I just want to make sure that our viewers can know where to find your podcast so they can hear more of these discussions before we let you go.
The All Revved Up podcast, All Revved Up, ALLREVDUP.org, and also on wherever you get your podcasts, All Revved Up.
Awesome. We will have you both back.
Amen.
Thank you so much for your time tonight. And when we return, some Tennessee parents are hoping to leave the past in the past. Why they're fighting for a part of Black history to be erased from the classroom. Keep it here. You're watching BNC. Welcome back to BNC Live. One school district in Tennessee may soon ban several history books after some parents express concern about what's being taught in the classroom. Here's the deal. Several of the books are about segregation and Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous March on Washington. Evan McMorris-Santoro reports.
Separate is never equal. We're pulled off the shelves by these laws that we're seeing spread up across the country.
Well, I think we're entering toward a pretty scary time if we're talking about politicians banning books. I thought we were long past those days. Educators know how to talk about race with kids in an age-appropriate way. These conversations can be had and in a way that is in keeping with our core values as Americans.
And coming up, we have an in-depth discussion on that story.
83 NBA championship, Moses Malone, the three-time NBA Most Valuable Player and 12-time NBA All-Star, is our BNC King of the Hill.
He was certainly a big deal.
He was a baller. I mean, you talk about a guy imposing his will. He was down on the low post, grabbing rebounds, turning around, spin moves, pivot, dunk, kick it out to Dr. J. He comes in and scores. And he was just a great player. And again, he came in from high school. So it kind of set the tone and a precedent. So when Kobe and when LeBron. And several guys like that, a handful of guys, they watched that, they said, hey, that's what I want to do.
Yeah, definitely. Because, I mean, so many of them, they say one day I want to be in the NBA, but no one ever imagines actually getting to go straight from high school without making that stop in college for those 4 years, or sometimes 3, depending on if they leave early.
Definitely. And anytime you decide that you want to be good enough and play at the pro level after making the jump from high school, it means you played every day pretty much as possible since Little League.
Yep. All right. Thank you there,
You
James. We're back with more news and entertainment after this. Stay with us.
Always hot.
Yeah, and it's and Brittany, this is typically the time we'll see those hurricanes ramp up in October as well.
Yeah, so hurricane season is far from over. November 30th is, the last day of hurricane season, but we've been pushing the envelope because it's been going into the Greek letters, but now no more Greek letters. We have a whole nother list of names, and I know I laugh about it, but Deshaun's on there. Deshaun is on there, and some other names. So we're excited for it.
We're excited for it. It's getting a little bit more ethnic in the meteorology realm.
Right.
All right. Thank you, Britt. Well, millions of Black Americans don't have health insurance because of their zip codes. Our Naja Sherman tells us how the nation's largest private health foundation says Congress has a chance to dramatically reduce the number of uninsured Americans of color.
More than 2.2 million people in the United States are being denied too often lost lives. For BNC, I'm Naja Sherman.
All right, so Britt, we didn't get lucky last night.
It wasn't me.
Yeah, it wasn't us. Well, there were no winners in Saturday's Powerball jackpot, bringing Monday's jackpot to $670 million. Yes,
wow.
According to Powerball, the jackpot was last hit in June and has since grown for 4 months. Man, that's crazy.
That is insane. 670 and on Monday?
Yeah.
So I know where I'll be.
We know we'll be right in line. But don't go anywhere. We'll be right here with more news and weather after this break. And we are back with Dr. Jonathan Collins with us tonight. He's a political science professor at Brown University. Dr. Collins, welcome back to BNC.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
So, Dr. Collins, obviously that story kind of troubling for any Black person that hears it. I want to turn your attention to this statement specifically from a woman in that story we just showed you moments ago. She said, quote, all this curriculum highlights is the mean white people and how the person is victimized and speaks of nothing of the good. Some would argue that's exactly why the stories need to be told in the first place. What do you think about that?
I thought it was a very one-sided perspective on why it's important to teach the true history of this country. Why it was important to inject this in the first place is because, for decades, since the construction of public education in the U.S., the history curriculum in particular has been, for lack of a better term, whitewashed. And so, whether there is either no representation or an extreme lack of representation for Black children seen in the way in which we teach our history classes across states, especially in the southern states, this has been a problem for an extremely long time. And so for Robin Steeman to have concern with the way in which white children might sort of have to deal with maybe some potential discomfort that comes along with learning that new truth, it's kind of dismissive of the fact that Black children have had to deal with discomfort for generations and generations now, whether we're talking about history or the way in which our schools have just sort of divested from the importance of educating Black children to the way in which we promise. So again, it's just a very one-sided perspective, and it doesn't acknowledge how important it is for Black children to see Black faces, especially positively represented Black faces in our school, in our books, and in our curriculum.
And you brought up an interesting point, because one of the statements made in the story was that it makes these kids feel bad when they see these types of pictures or see this type of language in a book like that. But you got to recognize the fact that Black people felt bad for how many years? So, talking more about that particular story, there are 4 books that are in question that focus on MLK's March at Washington. Ruby Bridges, who was the first Black person to desegregate an all-white elementary school in Louisiana, people who helped basically, shape our future. Is it trying to get rid of this a major blow to the Black community?
Well, I think it's a major blow to the Black community, but I think it's a major blow to America. The March on Washington was not just the march by Black people. The March on Washington, the beauty of it was that it was this multiracial coalition of people who rose and took a stand against racism. It was people of all colors who are on the monument on that specific weekend. And so, it rings true of kind of what we saw in the summer of 2020, when people of all different racial and ethnic backgrounds were marching for racial justice. It wasn't just Black people marching for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Honestly, there were more white people probably than Black people marching. And that's why we've seen more momentum on racial justice, I think, over the past year than we had maybe the 10 years before. Yeah. And so again, is removing these books from the schools, is this something hazardous to Black children? Yes, but it's hazardous to all children. Teaching this kind of history is important for everyone.
Yeah. And what type of impact does this have on our Black and brown kids if certain parts of history are left out?
Well, again, it becomes the message of sort of what you can and cannot be. And so, this is why media is so important. And this is why the Black News Channel is so important. It's because here's a space where little kids can look up and see themselves in journalists, see themselves in people who are, meteorologists. Right. And without that representation, Black children may not believe that those career paths are possible, that those lives are possible. And the same thing rings true with the representation in terms of history. Can Black children see themselves as the folks who are making history, the folks who are the saviors of this country, who are taking it in the right direction, who are on the right side from a moral perspective? When do most Black children typically see Black representation? It's usually centered around crime. It's usually centered around prison and incarceration, drug usage. And what we're trying to do with this curriculum is show that Black people have been pioneers for justice, for equality, and for the moral integrity of this country for centuries.
Yeah, you made so many good points there, Dr. Collins. And how relevant is our past to this very same moment that we're living in today, especially when it comes to reshaping the future?
It's scarily it's scary how consistent this is with some of the things that we've seen in the past. And so you can go back as far as the Civil War, where the Civil War in itself was this breaking point where you had your politicians from the North versus the South, and the politicians of the North finally had to accept that America can't persist as long as slavery is legal. And so the country literally fractures over this issue of whether or not slavery should persist in America. And then as a result, what we saw in the South was everything became about race, and everything became about preserving the sanctitude of slavery, even things that had nothing to do with slavery. And so what we're seeing now is kind of a continuation of that, because it's not just that folks like Robin Steeman are trying to ban books from the classrooms in Williamson, Tennessee. It's that they're also leading fronts that are dangerous in different ways. They're also the champions for anti-masking, anti-vaxxing, things that are making it difficult for Black people to literally survive. These two don't seem connected, but these are the same voices driven by the same impetus. They want a world where white people have certain opportunities, and there seems to be a complete disregard as to whether Black people have not only a quality of education, but a life in general.
Yeah, and I know many people question, how can inclusion be taught if everything isn't included?
Yeah, that's the big question, is that we preach diversity, we preach equity, we preach inclusion, we preach the idea of America being a melting pot. But then when we try to introduce curriculum into our schools that really centers around this idea of showing America as a true melting pot, where its builders and its pioneers are different across backgrounds, then there's pushback. These two things can't be consistent. If we're going to be a melting pot, if we're going to be a country that lives together, we have to also love each other and embrace the true history of what made this country what it is.
Well, Dr. Collins, we appreciate you. Meteorologist Brittany Lockley, you brought us up, and me being a role model, and everyone here, for those students, they got to know the things that we've done to become pioneers for this country. We appreciate your time tonight. Just ahead in sports, it's the fourth Sunday of the NFL regular season. We'll tell you how your team did in Week 4 highlights. Plus, find out what basketball Hall of Famer is tonight's King of the Hill. James Hill is up next.